grubs under the grass, quietly chewing through roots you can't even see from the surface, aphids clustering on every new leaf that was fine just yesterday, beetles showing up on plants that looked completely healthy 3 days ago. You spray for one, and another shows up within the week like it was patiently waiting its turn the whole time. You didn't sign up for any of this. You didn't sign up to be at war with your own backyard, checking every corner before you could actually relax in it. Here's what almost every video on this exact topic gets wrong. They tell you one treatment kills everything, instantly, completely, forever. Guaranteed, it doesn't. And deep down, you already knew that before you clicked on this video because you've bought that exact same promise before, and it didn't hold up then either. The pests were never the actual problem here. They're a symptom of something else entirely. Something in your yard has been quietly sending out an invitation every single night, whether you realized it or not, and nobody has ever actually shown you how to take it back for good. That invitation isn't one single thing sitting out there by itself. It's three separate ones working together, and once you see all three clearly laid out in front of you, you'll understand exactly why nothing you've tried so far was ever going to hold for very long, no matter how much of it you sprayed. Honest correction, hidden truth, and forever. Before this investigation actually starts, two things in the title need clearing up. Because a real case is only as good as the honesty of the file it's built on, and I'd rather start from solid ground than build an entire investigation on top of a shaky premise. Hidden truth doesn't mean secret in any real sense of that word. Nobody is deliberately suppressing this information from you, and there's no committee somewhere quietly deciding what a homeowner is or isn't allowed to know about their own yard and property. The real reason this doesn't get explained clearly very often in mainstream content is simpler and far less dramatic than any conspiracy could ever be. There's genuinely no product to sell around telling someone to move a woodpile 6 feet to the left, or fix a slow dripping hose bib that's been running for months, or pull mulch back a few inches from a foundation wall. None of that comes packaged in a bottle with a label and a price tag attached to it. So almost nobody bothers explaining it properly and thoroughly on camera, and that plain silence gets mistaken for secrecy when it's really just the ordinary absence of anything worth advertising or monetizing. This isn't a secret at all. It's just not sellable in any meaningful way, and that's the whole reason. Nobody ever explained it to you properly before. Now, Forever needs that same level of honesty applied to it just as carefully. This isn't a claim that you spray or apply something exactly once and then never think about pests again for the rest of your life with zero further effort required on your part at any point. What it actually means, stated as plainly as possible, is that the recurring cycle stops once the specific conditions causing it are identified, removed, and kept removed going forward. That's a real, durable, meaningful result, and it genuinely holds up under honest scrutiny. It's just not a magic permanence that requires absolutely nothing further from you ever again. And pretending otherwise would set you up to feel like the whole approach failed the very first time an unrelated new problem shows up somewhere else in the yard for a completely different reason entirely. Every real investigation starts at the scene, not with a suspect already in handcuffs. So before we talk about what actually stops pests for good, let's walk the actual perimeter of your yard together and see exactly what's been leaving the door open the whole time, without you realizing it. The crime scene, walking the perimeter start at the very first thing most people walk straight past without ever giving it a second look or a second thought, somewhere near a downspout or in a low spot where the yard naturally slopes downward, or in a shaded corner that never quite fully dries out even a full day. After the last rain has come and gone completely, there's usually a patch of consistently damp ground just waiting to be discovered. Maybe it's a hose bib with a slow, quiet drip that's been going on for so long you genuinely stopped noticing it months or even years ago. Maybe it's an irrigation timer that was set years back during a different season and has been running the exact same fixed schedule ever since, completely regardless of actual season, recent rainfall, or genuine plant need at any given time. Standing water and consistently damp soil are the very first thing Almost every recurring pest problem traces directly back to when you actually go looking for it, because moisture is the single resource nearly every pest genuinely needs to survive and often can't reliably find on its own in a dry, well-managed yard. Keep walking the perimeter, and the second piece of evidence usually isn't hard to find either, once you know exactly to look for it in the right places. Fallen fruit left sitting under a tree for days on end because nobody quite got around to clearing it away before it started attracting attention. A small gap in a trash bin lid that never fully seals shut the way it's actually supposed to, no matter how many times it gets closed. Pet food left sitting out in a bowl overnight instead of being brought back inside after dinner the way it probably should be. And here's the one detail that genuinely surprises people almost every single time this comes up in conversation. Certain common plants host sap-feeding insects that leave behind a sugary, sticky residue on the leaves directly beneath them, and that residue quietly draws in an entirely separate wave of pests that have absolutely nothing to do with whatever originally caused the first problem in the first place. One small, seemingly unrelated issue ends up quietly inviting a second, completely different one that looks nothing like it on the surface at first glance. The third piece of evidence is usually the easiest of the three to overlook entirely, mainly because it tends to look intentional, like something that was actually built on purpose rather than simply left behind by accident or neglect. Mulch piled directly up against the foundation of the house instead of being pulled back a reasonable few inches the way it should be. A stack of firewood that genuinely hasn't been touched, moved, or restacked in 2 full seasons. Dense, unmanaged ground cover grown so thick and tangled that sunlight and airflow never actually reach the soil underneath it at any point during the entire day. All three of these conditions create exactly the kind of dark, undisturbed, consistently humid pocket that countless different pests are actively searching for as a safe place to shelter, hide, and breed completely undisturbed and unnoticed for as long as possible. Moisture, food, and shelter aren't just neutral conditions sitting there by pure coincidence. To a pest, that specific combination is an open address written clearly on it. 3 invitations found, all in one short walk around the yard, which means the spray bottle sitting in your hand right now was never actually investigating the right suspect in the first place. The suspect lineup, ruling out reactive spraying, treat spraying the exact way a careful, methodical investigator would treat a suspect with a partial alibi rather than dismissing it outright as useless or accepting it completely as the full solution. It's not entirely innocent here, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. It does do something real and genuinely measurable in the moment. Whatever it directly contacts, it kills on contact, and that specific part of the claim holds up perfectly well under real, honest scrutiny every single time. But when you actually check its alibi carefully against the 3 conditions we just discovered together walking the perimeter, spray has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with any of them. It doesn't dry out the damp patch sitting near the downspout. It doesn't clear away the fallen fruit, slowly rotting under the tree. It doesn't pull the mulch back a few inches from the foundation, and it certainly doesn't move that stack of firewood that's been sitting untouched for 2 full seasons now. Spray was never built to touch any of that in the first place because it was never actually designed to address an underlying condition at all, only a visible pest standing directly in front of you in that exact single moment, nothing more. Spray is guilty of killing what's already there in that exact moment. It has a rock-solid, airtight alibi for everything that shows up again next week. Reel out the wrong suspect once and for all, and the evidence naturally points somewhere nobody thinks to look first, toward the actual, measurable difference between why pests visit a yard just once in passing and why they keep coming back to that exact same yard over and over again without fail. The evidence. Why the invitation matters more than the pest of a single pest wandering into your yard on any given day is mostly just simple chance. Nothing more meaningful than that. It's moving through the area. It happened to pass by at that particular moment for reasons that have nothing to do with you. And whether it decides to stay a while or simply moves along largely depends on what it actually finds once it gets there. A colony or a broader population establishing itself and returning reliably season after season, year after year, is a completely different situation entirely, and it deserves to be treated as such rather than lumped in with a single random passerby. That's a direct, measurable, predictable response to a location that reliably offers moisture, food, and shelter all in roughly the same concentrated area over and over again without any meaningful interruption to break the cycle. Remove any single one of those three conditions entirely on its own, and the location becomes noticeably less viable as a long-term place to settle down and multiply. Remove all three simultaneously and completely, and there's very little structural reason left for anything to establish itself there permanently. Even though individual pests will still continue passing through occasionally to some small unavoidable degree, which is simply true of any outdoor space that exists anywhere in the real world. The realistic goal here was never an impossible absolute zero, with nothing ever passing through again. It was always as about removing the actual underlying reasons a population would specifically choose to stay and multiply in that exact spot, rather than simply moving along somewhere else entirely. Once the invitation itself has genuinely been removed and addressed properly, across the board, there's still one more crucial piece of evidence needed to close this particular case for good, something physical rather than chemical that stops whatever's left over from crossing back in during the transition period while conditions are still settling into their new corrected state. The fix. Closing the case. The physical barrier that finally closes this case is a fine mineral powder made from the fossilized remains of microscopic organisms that lived in ancient water millions of years ago, ground down until it looks and feels like nothing more than ordinary household dust to the naked eye at first glance. Under magnification, though, it's actually composed of countless microscopically sharp particles, edges genuinely too small to see with the naked eye, but more than sharp enough to matter at the tiny scale a small insect operates on. When a crawling, soft-bodied pest makes physical contact with this powder as it moves across it, those sharp particles compromise the thin, waxy protective coating that pest relies on entirely to hold moisture inside its own body throughout its life. Once that protective coating is damaged even slightly by contact, the pest begins losing moisture it has absolutely no way to replace on its own, and it gradually dehydrates over the course of the following day or two, quietly and without any single dramatic event marking the exact moment it happens. This is a physical mechanism at work here, not a chemical one, and that specific distinction genuinely matters more than it might initially sound like it should. A physical mechanism has no biological pathway whatsoever for anything to develop resistance against over time. Unlike the way pests can and eventually do build up genuine resistance against a repeated chemical treatment used again and again across multiple successive generations. You simply cannot evolve a defense against being physically compromised at that basic a structural level, no matter how many generations pass or how much time goes by. Doesn't poison anything at all in the process. It just makes crossing that particular line physically impossible to survive for whatever attempts it. No exceptions. Knowing what the barrier actually is only matters if it also gets applied correctly and consistently, and this is exactly where people who've tried something along these lines before usually went wrong the very first time they attempted it, often without realizing their mistake at all. The exact method by only food-grade material specifically, and check the bag carefully every single time before you commit to purchasing it. There's a second, differently processed version of this same basic material sold specifically for swimming pool filtration systems, and that version has been treated at a much higher temperature during its manufacturing process, which changes its internal structure entirely and makes it considerably more hazardous if it's ever inhaled, whether by you, your children, or your pets moving through the same treated area. Read the bag closely before you buy it every time. If it clearly says food grade somewhere prominent on the label, that's the correct product to purchase. If it mentions pool filtration, filter grade, or anything at all, related to water treatment systems anywhere on that same label. Put it back on the shelf immediately and keep looking elsewhere. Instead, defy it in thin, deliberate lines, specifically along foundations, known entry points, and the outer perimeter of whatever areas you're actually trying to protect, rather than broadcasting it loosely and generously across an entire open lawn where it accomplishes considerably less useful work per bag purchased and creates unnecessary airborne dust in the process for no real added benefit to show for it. Apply it only on a genuinely dry day, ideally with no rain expected anywhere in the forecast for at least 24 hours afterward, since even a small amount of unexpected moisture causes those fine particles to clump together and lose their sharp structure almost immediately upon contact. If rain does happen to reach it before it's had enough time to work properly and do its job, that's not a failure of the product itself in any way. It's simply a clear signal that it's time to reapply once the ground has had a proper chance to dry back out again fully, costs and closed on paper, at least in theory. But does this actually hold up when you go back and check the real evidence a few weeks later? Under genuine outdoor conditions instead of just accepting it in theory and moving on. Verified proof. The follow-up investigation, 2 sections of yard were tested carefully side by side under otherwise identical outdoor conditions, same soil type throughout, same general sun exposure across both sections, same starting level of visible activity, before anything at all was changed in either one. Zone A had all 3 invitations addressed directly and completely, with nothing left half-finished. The damp patch near the downspout got corrected by adjusting the irrigation timer properly and fixing the slow drip at the hose bib once and for all. The fallen fruit and other food sources got cleared away entirely and kept consistently clear going forward from that point on. The mulch got pulled back a full few inches from the foundation wall exactly as recommended, and the barrier itself was applied carefully and thoroughly at every single identified entry point around the full perimeter. Zone B served purely as the control for direct comparison purposes. The exact same barrier was applied using the exact same method at the exact same entry points. But none of the 3 underlying conditions were touched or adjusted in any way at all, left completely as they were originally found during that very first walkthrough together. In week 1, both zones showed a real, genuinely measurable reduction in visible activity since the barrier itself was doing its job effectively in both locations equally at that early stage, exactly as the underlying mechanism would predict, regardless of what happens with the other conditions. By week 3, though, Zone B's activity had climbed back up close to where it originally started from, because the same untouched conditions were still actively and continuously drawing new pests in from the surrounding area, regardless of the barrier sitting right there at the entry points the entire time without interruption. Zona stayed noticeably lower during that same 3-week window, since there was comparatively very little left in that section actively attracting anything new to begin with, having already removed the underlying reasons anything would want to stay there in the first place. By week 6, Zone A needed only a light touch-up reapplication of the barrier following a single rain event that had washed some of it away temporarily. Zone B needed the exact same full reapplication it had needed all the way back in week 1 and was already showing early, unmistakable signs of the identical cycle beginning to repeat itself all over again, exactly as it had the very first time around, with no real improvement to show for the repeated effort. I want to be completely honest about what this particular follow-up investigation genuinely couldn't rule out, because a real, credible case doesn't get to conveniently skip over its own limitations just because the overall result happened to be positive and encouraging. This doesn't guarantee an absolute zero pests forever under every single possible circumstance that could ever arise in the real world. A heavily infested neighboring property located right next door, an unusually extreme weather event passing through the region, or an entirely new and unrelated source, introduced later down the line, can still bring some renewed pressure back into an otherwise well-managed, well-maintained yard, no matter how thoroughly the original 3 conditions were addressed. What Removing the three conditions actually does, reliably and measurably, is reset the baseline dramatically lower and keep it there consistently over an extended period of time. It doesn't and can't promise an impossible, permanent zero that requires absolutely nothing further from anyone involved. Ever again, under any circumstances whatsoever, no matter how the surrounding environment might change. Sam Barrier, same exact product used both places, two completely different long-term results depending entirely on the zone. The difference was never actually the powder itself. It was always the invitation sitting underneath it. The maintenance reality, keeping the case closed, here's what forever actually requires going forward from this point on, stated as plainly and honestly as possible rather than left vague, ambiguous, or quietly oversold the way most videos on this topic tend to leave it. Reapply the barrier at entry points after any rain event washes it away, since that's simply how the material physically works and always will continue to work, regardless of how well the underlying conditions are otherwise being managed going forward from here. Walk the perimeter every so often, maybe roughly once a month during the active outdoor growing season, specifically checking that the same three conditions haven't quietly crept back in on their own again, without anyone noticing in the meantime. A drip that mysteriously starts us up again months later after seeming fixed. A new small pile of debris left sitting in a corner after a weekend project wraps up. Mulch that gets pushed back up against the foundation during a routine fall cleanup without anyone stopping to think twice about exactly where it's actually being placed this time around. This entire ongoing maintenance routine takes a matter of minutes each month once you genuinely know exactly what you're looking for and why it matters. It genuinely isn't a recurring purchase cycle you're locked into indefinitely, and it isn't a weekly spraying ritual that never actually resolves anything happening underneath the surface, no matter how many times you repeat it. Cost comparison. A bag of food-grade barrier material typically costs only a few dollars total and covers multiple applications across an entire outdoor season of periodic touch-ups whenever they're actually needed going forward. Repeated commercial pest control sprays, by direct comparison, run considerably more expensive across that same season and need to be reapplied on a fixed, recurring schedule regardless of whether the underlying conditions have actually changed at all. In the meantime, precisely because those particular sprays were never designed to address those root conditions in the first place, only the visible symptoms sitting temporarily on top of them. One approach ends up treating a recurring symptom indefinitely, season after season, year after year, with no real endpoint ever in sight. The other approach actually closes the underlying case for good, addressing the reason the problem exists rather than just its most recent visible expression. Ending the verdict. So here's the verdict on everything. This investigation actually found across every section we walked through together, laid out plainly and honestly, rather than wrapped up with more confidence than the evidence itself actually supports. The pests were never the real defendant in this entire case from the very beginning. They were responding consistently and predictably to evidence that had been sitting in plain sight the whole time, evidence you can genuinely identify and control yourself without needing anyone's help, any special equipment, or any expensive service call. Hidden truth never meant a secret deliberately being kept from you by anyone with something to hide. It meant something underexplained simply because nobody could package it neatly in a bottle and sell it to you at a markup worth advertising. And forever never meant zero effort required for the rest of your life with absolutely nothing further asked of you going forward. It meant the cycle stops repeating for as long as the specific conditions causing it stay removed and maintained, which is a real, honest, and genuinely durable result to hold on to once you actually understand what you're managing and precisely why it works. The yard that slowly turned into something you had to brace yourself against every time you walked outside can go back to being the place you actually relax in without a second thought. The place your kids can sit down in the grass again without you checking it first, without that quiet exhaustion setting in before you've even stepped out the back door. Tell me in the comments which of the three invitations you found first. When you actually walked your own perimeter this week, the moisture, the food source, or the shelter condition. I genuinely want to know which one shows up most often across everyone watching this video, because that specific pattern tells me exactly what to investigate next in a future follow-up. And if you want more of this going forward, real investigations instead of quick fixes, actual root causes instead of surface level symptoms treated repeatedly over and over again without progress, hit subscribe now. This particular case closed successfully. The next one's already sitting open, waiting to be investigated.